The day Wallace Fletcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a worn saddle, a borrowed horse, and a heart so cracked down the middle he reckoned it would never hold water again, was the same day Hester Bell dropped every last egg she owned right in the middle of Main Street and didn't shed a single tear about it. That was the first thing he noticed about her. Not the dark copper hair that had come loose from its pins in the August wind, not the pale green dress that was too fine for a woman who clearly did her own hauling, not even the way every man on that dusty boardwalk turned to look at her, and then looked away just as quickly, as if they were afraid of something they couldn't name. What he noticed first was that she stood there in the wreckage of a dozen broken eggs, flour dust rising around her boots, and she simply pressed her lips together, squared her shoulders, and started picking up the pieces of the basket that could still be saved. No crying, no cursing, no looking around to see who had witnessed her misfortune. Wallace Fletcher, 28 years old and fresh out of 3 years driving cattle across the Kisham Trail for a man who had cheated him out of half his wages, pulled his horse to a stop and watched her for a moment longer than was polite. The year was 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kansas-Indian Territory border like a man leaning over a cliff, half civilized and half wild. The cattle drive still came through in their season, bringing dust and noise and money that lasted about as long as a summer rainstorm. There was a proper church now, and a schoolhouse, and a dry goods store run by a man named Orson Pruitt who kept his thumb on every scale in the territory and smiled while he did it. There was also a sheriff who did his job when it suited him, which was not always when it needed doing. Wallace had no intention of staying. He had a plan, modest as it was, to collect what money he had saved, buy himself a small parcel of land somewhere in Colorado where the cattle business was still honest, and live quietly for the rest of his days. He was tired in the bones and tired in the soul, which is the worst kind of tired because sleep doesn't fix it. But he pulled his horse to a stop and he watched Hester Bell pick up the ruins of her morning, and something in him shifted, not dramatically, not the way the dime novels described it with lightning and bells. It was quieter than that. It was the way a compass needle settles north, quiet and inevitable and without ceremony. He swung down from the saddle before he had decided to do it. "Can I help you with that?" he said. She looked up at him, and her eyes were the color of creek water over slate, gray-green and very clear. And she looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether he is worth the trouble of answering. "I don't believe eggs can be unbroken," she said, "but thank you for the offer." Her voice was steady. Not cold exactly, but self-contained in a way that told him she was accustomed to managing alone. "No," he agreed, "but the basket can be fixed. I'm handy with a bit of cord." She studied him another moment. He was aware of what she was seeing. A tall man, lean and sun-darkened, with dusty trail clothes and honest hands and eyes that were probably a little too tired for a man his age. He had been told he looked older than 28. The trail did that to a person. "I'm Hester Bell," she said finally. "I live at the old Morrow place 2 miles east. I manage it alone since my father passed last spring." She didn't say it for sympathy. She said it the way a person states a fact that requires no embellishment. "Wallace Fletcher," he said, and picked up what remained of the basket. He fixed the basket with a length of cord from his saddlebag while she waited without fidgeting, which he respected. They exchanged no more than 30 words in the time it took, and when it was done she thanked him in a voice that was genuine but careful and walked back in the direction of the general store. Wallace watched her go and thought, "I have no business being in Caldwell at all." Then he walked his horse to the livery stable and paid for a week. He told himself it was practical. He needed to rest the horse. He needed to resupply. He needed to write a letter to his brother in Missouri and let him know he was still alive. All of these things were true, and none of them were the real reason, and he was not so foolish as to pretend otherwise to himself, though he was careful not to think about it too directly. He got a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Alma Fitch, a wide woman with a shrewd face and surprisingly kind eyes who charged him 50 cents a night, and told him meals were at 6 and 7 and not in between, and that she didn't allow drinking above the ground floor. He ate supper that first evening at a long table with 4 other boarders. A surveyor named Cole, who never looked up from his plate, an elderly man called Dooley, who claimed to have scouted for the army but told his stories with too many embellishments to be entirely believed, a young schoolteacher named Anselm who had arrived just 2 weeks prior from Ohio and still looked slightly confused by the light, and a woman named Mrs. Croft who had come to town to settle her late husband's debts and appeared to be in no hurry to leave. It was Mrs. Croft who mentioned Hester Bell without any prompting at all, the way small towns offer information to newcomers like a gift that hasn't been requested. "You'll want to avoid asking Orson Pruitt for any kind of credit," she said to the table generally. "He's got half the county in his ledger, poor Hester Bell included. Her father borrowed against the farm before he died, and Pruitt's been slow-walking his patients about collecting, waiting to see if she'll break and sell." "She doesn't seem like a woman who breaks easily," Wallace said before he thought about whether he should. Mrs. Croft looked at him with a neat, quick interest. "You've met her?" "Briefly." "In the street. She's a good woman," Mrs. Croft said. "Works that farm herself with one hired hand who's older than the hills and half as useful. Grows a kitchen garden, keeps chickens, sells eggs when she has them. She was supposed to marry Frank Alderman 2 years ago, but he went up to Dodge City and came back different, and she sent him packing." She paused. "People around here think she's proud." "And what do you think?" Wallace asked. Mrs. Croft considered him. "I think she's got better sense than to call what she knows pride." He lay awake that night and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of Caldwell settling into itself, the distant clatter from the saloon down the block, the horses shifting in the stable, a dog that barked twice and then gave up. He thought about Colorado. He thought about the piece of land he'd been imagining for 3 years, green in spring and gold in fall, with a creek running through it and nobody to cheat him out of anything. He thought about a woman with creek-water eyes who picked up broken things without crying about them. In the morning he went to the general store, not because he needed anything urgently, but because a man has to buy something eventually, and Orson Pruitt's store was the only one in town. Pruitt was a man of 50 or so, with the kind of carefully maintained geniality that covers harder things underneath. He was efficient and pleasant, and his smile never quite reached his eyes, and Wallace took his measure in about 30 seconds and proceeded with appropriate caution. He was buying tobacco and a new box of matches when the bell above the door rang, and Hester Bell came in with a crate of eggs, fresh ones this time, and set them on the counter with the quiet authority of a woman who has done this 100 times before. Pruitt counted them with slow deliberation, entering the number in his ledger with a stub of pencil, and then he said without looking up, "This doesn't make much of a dent in what's owed Hester." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm aware of that, Orson." "Your father's note comes due at the end of September," he said, still not looking up. $60, that's a significant sum for a woman on her own." "I am aware of that too," she said. "I've had inquiries about that land," he said, and now he did look up, and his expression was the expression of a man offering kindness as a trap. "Good inquiries, a fair price." "The land is not for sale," she said. Wallace was standing 6 feet away and making a considerable study of a bolt of calico he had absolutely no use for. "Well," Pruitt said pleasantly, "circumstances have a way of clarifying a person's options." He closed the ledger. "I'll credit you the usual rate for the eggs." She nodded once and left, and Wallace counted out his coins for the tobacco and the matches, and he did not look at Pruitt when he said, "Is there a man in this town who does any kind of work? Hauling, fencing, that sort of thing?" Pruitt looked up. "What kind of work do you have in mind?" "Not mine," Wallace said. "I'm looking for something to do for a week while my horse rests. I've got good hands and I'm not particular." He ended up, 2 hours later, riding out to the Morrow place east of town in the company of Dooley, who had offered to show him the way in exchange for the prospect of an interesting morning. The farm was modest and showing the strain of being managed without enough labor. The fence line on the west side had 3 posts that needed resetting. The chicken coop had a roof that was developing ambitions of leaving the building, and the vegetable garden was producing well but clearly needed more hands than one woman could provide. Hester Bell came out of the house when she heard horses, and she shaded her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and suspicion. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. "Miss Bell," he took off his hat. "I find myself with time on my hands and a need for honest work. I don't need much pay. I'm decent with fences and not bad with a hammer." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, Dooley helpfully said nothing, which was a mercy. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer, but the full truth was not something he was ready to lay out in a dooryard on a Thursday morning, so he said the portion of it that was still accurate. "Because I was raised to work and I don't know what else to do with myself when I'm standing still." Something in her expression eased just fractionally. "I can't pay much. I'm not asking for much." She looked at the fence line and then back at him. "The west fence is bad. And the coop roof is going to be trouble before fall." "I can see that from here," he said. And so it began, in the most unromantic and practical possible fashion, which was perhaps the most honest way it could have begun. He worked the farm for 2 days that first week. The fence posts and the coop roof and the drainage ditch beside the garden that was threatening to flood the onion beds. And by the end of the second day, they had accumulated enough conversation between working to know something real about each other. He learned that her father had been a man of great optimism and poor financial judgment, that she had 2 brothers who had gone west to California before the debt had fully landed and had not offered to come back, that she had a dog named Abraham who was very old and slept most of the time but still managed to look dignified, and that she had been running this farm alone since the previous April with a hired hand named Emmett Gale who was 63, partially deaf, and worth his weight in gold for knowing every quirk of the land even if his body couldn't always keep pace with what his mind still understood. Emmett Gale regarded Wallace Fletcher with the serene skepticism of a man who has outlived several generations of young people with ideas, and said very little to him directly for the first week, which Wallace accepted as reasonable. She learned that he had come from Missouri, from a family of 5 boys, that he had driven cattle for 6 years total before the last run that had gone wrong with the cheating wages, that he had a mother still living in Hannibal who wrote him long letters that he answered shorter ones in return because he was not gifted with words on paper, and that he had once, at the age of 20, intended to study law but had run out of money and run into the cattle business instead. "Do you regret it?" she asked. They were sitting on the porch steps at the end of the second day, drinking the sweet tea she had brought out in tin cups, and the evening light was coming in low and gold across the fields. He thought about it honestly. "Some days," he said, "less than I used to." She nodded as though that was a complete and satisfying answer, which it was more than it might seem. He went back to Mrs. Fitch's boarding house that evening and sat on the edge of his bed and thought, "I am in serious trouble here." He went back to the farm the following Monday, because there was still work that needed doing, and the Monday after that, and the one after that. Somewhere in the 3rd week of September, he stopped thinking of it as temporary work for a resting horse and started thinking of it as the thing he was doing, which was a significant shift in how he understood his own situation. The social calculus of Caldwell in 1878 was not a simple thing. A woman alone on a farm, a man appearing regularly at that farm, tongues were inevitable. Mrs. Croft mentioned it to Wallace gently one evening, in the way she had of saying difficult things as if she were merely commenting on the weather. "People are talking," she said. "People generally do," he said. "She has a reputation to consider," Mrs. Croft said, and her voice was not unkind. "She doesn't have people to protect her in the way that some women do. Her position in this town is already narrow. He thought about that for a long time. He was not oblivious. He had seen the looks in town, the way certain women at the church in Hester attended the First Baptist Church of Caldwell with perfect weekly regularity, seemed to conduct their conversations in her direction while technically speaking to someone else. He had seen the way Pruitt watched the farm's situation with the patient satisfaction of a man who believes time is on his side. He went to the farm the next morning and Hester was in the garden, tying up the last of the late summer beans, and he stood at the gate until she looked up. "I need to say something," he said. She straightened up and waited. He took off his hat, which was something he did when he was being serious. "I don't want to be a problem for you, not in terms of what people are saying. I've been thinking about it and I want you to know that my intentions toward you are—" He stopped, because the word he wanted was honest but the sentence didn't know how to end itself. She looked at him steadily. "What are they, Mr. Fletcher?" "Serious," he said. "They are serious." There was a long silence in which a bird called somewhere in the elm tree at the corner of the property and Abraham the old dog lifted his head and then put it back down. "I see," she said. "I should have said it sooner," he said, "but I was working up to being certain." "And are you certain now?" He met her eyes. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, in a voice that was very careful and very even, "I have been managing alone for 1.5 years, Mr. Fletcher. I have gotten quite used to depending on no one but myself. That is not a complaint, it is simply the truth. I do not find it easy to trust what men say about their intentions." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust what I say. I'm asking you to watch what I do." That landed somewhere in her. He could see it, the way something shifted in her face, not much, but enough. "Then I suppose," she said, "you had better keep doing what you're doing." It was not an embrace, and it was not a declaration, and it was not in any way what the dime novels would have called a romantic moment. But Wallace Fletcher felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for the better part of 3 years, and he put his hat back on, and went to fix the gate on the south pasture that had been hanging wrong since he'd first arrived. October came in cool and gold, and the rhythm of things between them changed in the way that the rhythm of seasons changes. So gradually, you don't notice it until you look back and see how far you have come from where you started. He brought her a book from the general store, a collection of poems he had no particular interest in himself, but that Mrs. Croft had mentioned she admired, and Hester looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him, and said thank you in a voice that was different from her usual thank you, warmer and less guarded. He stayed for supper that evening and ate with her and old Emmett Gale, who was beginning to address him by his first name without being asked, which Wallace understood to be the highest form of acceptance available from that quarter. She began saving a cup of coffee for him in the mornings, setting it on the porch rail when she heard his horse coming up the track, and that cup of coffee, waiting there every morning, became something he measured his days against. On the mornings when he didn't go to the farm, there were a few, when rain kept him in town or when he had an errand that couldn't wait. He was conscious of its absence in a way that was almost physical. In the evenings, when the work was done and they sat on the porch in the cooling air, they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who have stopped performing for each other. She told him about the books she had loved as a child and the ones she still read by lamplight after the house was quiet. He told her about the prairie at night on a cattle drive, the way the stars were so thick and near you felt you could hear them. She talked about the debt with a matter-of-factness that told him she had been carrying the anxiety of it alone for so long it had become simply part of how she understood the world, like gravity. He listened without offering false reassurance, because she was too intelligent for that, and that choice seemed to mean more to her than comfort would have. The debt was real, and September had come and gone without the $60 being found. And Pruitt had extended his patience with the particular generosity of a man who wants to appear magnanimous while actually tightening a net. The extension had come with new terms, interest added, which brought the total closer to $75, and Hester had listened to those new terms with a white face and said nothing in Pruitt's presence, and then had driven the wagon home with her hands very still on the reins. Wallace had $70 in savings. He had been collecting it for Colorado. He thought about this for 3 days before he said anything, because he understood that the money itself was not the delicate part. The delicate part was the meaning she might attach to it, the weight of obligation it might lay on her, the way it might shift the balance between them from something equal to something less than equal. And she was a woman who needed equality the way most people need water. He framed it, finally, as a loan with written terms, the kind of thing that any two people in a business arrangement might enter into. He wrote it out on a piece of paper, interest-free, repayable at any time that suited her, witnessed by Emmett Gale, who signed his name in large, uneven letters, and then went back to sharpening his knife with the air of a man who has seen everything and is impressed by nothing. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table and looked at him with those creekwater eyes that were very clear and very deep. "This is your land money," she said. "The Colorado money." "I know what it is," he said. "Then why?" He looked at her and thought about lying, which he was not capable of, and about a truth he wasn't entirely sure she was ready for, and he said carefully, "Because I find that I am not as interested in Colorado as I used to be." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said softly, with a gravity that was its own kind of declaration, "Wallace." It was the first time she had used his given name. She had been calling him Mr. Fletcher for 6 weeks, which had become a kind of running joke between them. And the joke had landed this way now, on this piece of paper and this quiet room with the lamp burning low, in the simplest possible statement of something vast. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was calloused from work and warm, and she turned it over and held his back. And they sat like that for a while without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the silence wasn't already saying perfectly well. He paid Pruitt the $75 on a Wednesday in early November, in coins and bills counted out carefully onto that ledger that had Hester's name written in it. And Pruitt took the money with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and wrote "paid" in large letters and added the date. And Wallace picked up the receipt and pocketed it without looking at Pruitt directly, because he did not trust himself to maintain appropriate civility. The relief on Hester's face when she held that receipt was something he kept in his memory like a pressed flower. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in all the time he had known her, not once that he had seen. But she pressed the receipt to her chest with both hands and closed her eyes for just a moment, and that was enough. "I will pay you back," she said, and she meant it with her whole self, which is something you can hear in a person's voice when it's true. "I know you will," he said, "when you're ready." He didn't tell her that the money wasn't what he was thinking about at all. November in Kansas on the open plains was a season of gray and wind and bare trees and wood smoke. And it was during that November that Wallace Fletcher began to understand, in the fullest and most certain possible way, that he was in love with Hester Bell. He had been edging toward the understanding for weeks. But it crystallized on a Tuesday afternoon when he came to the farm and found her in the barn with a newborn calf that had come early and weak and cold, and she was on her knees in the straw with the calf's head in her lap, rubbing warmth into it with her bare hands, talking to it in a low voice, the same steady and unsentimental voice she used for everything, saying, "Come on now. Come on, you can do it." He stood in the barn door and watched her, and the calf did live ultimately, because she willed it to with sheer practical determination. And when it finally found its feet and wobbled toward its mother, Hester sat back on her heels in the straw with straw in her hair and oil on her hands and smiled. And it was a real smile, unguarded and full, and Wallace Fletcher thought, "I would do absolutely anything for this woman, without hesitation or reservation, for the rest of my natural life." He said none of this out loud, but he carried it with him from that day forward like a compass, always there, always pointing him in the right direction. He asked her if he could call on her formally, one Sunday afternoon in late November, which made her raise an eyebrow because he had been at her farm 6 days out of every 7 for the past 2 months. And he explained, a little awkwardly, that he understood that wasn't the same thing, not officially, not in a way that was clear to either of them or to the community that was watching them with considerable interest. "Are you asking my permission to court me, Mr. Fletcher?" she said, and there was a light in her eyes that was something between amusement and something warmer. "I am," he said. "And I know I'm late in asking formally, given everything, but I wanted to be sure, and now I am, and I'm asking." "You are the most deliberate man I have ever met," she said. "I know." "I find that I don't entirely mind it," she said, which was, from Hester Bell, the equivalent of a declaration written in fireworks. He walked her to church that Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and Caldwell, which had been watching them with the sharp collective attention of a small community with limited entertainment options, began to settle into a new understanding of what Wallace Fletcher and Hester Bell were to each other. Some people approved and some people had opinions, and old Dooley at the boarding house slapped him on the back in a way that implied proud congratulation, and Mrs. Fitch raised her rate for his room by 5 cents per night, whether as a celebration or as a commentary on improved circumstances. Wallace was never entirely sure. He kissed her for the first time in December, on the porch of the Morrow farm after a Sunday dinner she had cooked that was extraordinary in the way that food is extraordinary when it comes from someone who knows how to pay attention to things. He had been walking her back to the door, and she had turned at the threshold, and they were very close, and the moment had a gravity to it that required no particular initiative on either of their parts. It simply fell together the way things do when they have been moving toward each other for long enough. Her lips were warm, and she kissed him back with the same quiet certainty that she brought to everything. And when they separated, she looked at him for a moment with those clear eyes and said nothing, and he said nothing, and it was perhaps the most entirely satisfying moment of his life up to that point. He proposed on New Year's Day, 1879, which was also the first significant snowfall of that particular winter, the kind of snow that turns the Kansas plains into something almost otherworldly, white and still and vast. He had the ring, a simple gold band he had bought from the jeweler in Caldwell in December, paying for it in installments over 3 weeks so as not to deplete his remaining funds. It was not an elaborate ring, but it was honest, which seemed appropriate. He was sitting with her in the parlor of the farmhouse, which she had made into a room of quiet distinction with very little money and considerable ingenuity, a quilt her mother had made, books arranged by size on a shelf Emmett Gale had built and sanded smooth, a lamp with a green glass shade that cast the whole room in the color of spring. The snow was coming down outside the window, thick and steady. "Hester," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, which was fortunate. She looked up from her mending. He took the ring out of his vest pocket, and her hands went very still in her lap, and she looked at the ring and then at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, open and unguarded in a way that made him feel trusted in the deepest possible way. "I love you," he said. "I have for months, and I should have said it before now, but I wanted to say it first alongside this, so you would know that one comes with the other. I am asking you to marry me. Not because it is practical or because of the farm, or because of anything other than the fact that I am profoundly and irreversibly in love with you, and I want to spend every day I have left on this earth proving that." She was very quiet. Then she said, "Wallace Fletcher." "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said, and her voice had a different quality to it, thick and low in a way that told him the feeling was not small. "I have been telling myself for 3 months that I was being sensible and careful and not rushing headlong into anything, and every single day you have come up that road on your horse and I have thought, there he is, and felt—" She stopped. "I am not very good at this," she said. "You are doing perfectly," he said. She held out her left hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and they sat there in the green lamplight with the snow coming down, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was the first time she had done that, and he put his arm around her. And Abraham the old dog snored by the fire, and Emmett Gale was somewhere in the barn probably pretending not to know what was happening in the house, and everything was exactly as it should be. They set the wedding for March, which gave the community time to have its opinions and arrange itself accordingly. Reverend Thomas Alcott, who presided over the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, was a tall man of 60 with a kind face and a preacher's gift for reading the emotional temperature of a room. He met with them twice before the wedding to discuss the ceremony, and he looked at them together with the thoughtful expression of a man who has married enough couples to know the real thing from the arranged thing. "You two have a quality about you," he said, after the second meeting. "A steadiness." "She's steady," Wallace said. "I'm working on it." Hester looked at him sideways. "You have been the most steady person in my life for the past 6 months, she said, matter-of-factly, and then seemed slightly surprised that she had said it out loud. Alcott smiled. In February, about 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that threw the preparations into temporary crisis, and also revealed something about the community of Caldwell that neither Wallace nor Hester had quite expected. Pruitt, apparently having decided that the loss of the farm debt was not going to be the end of his interest in Hester's situation, had begun a quiet campaign to suggest to certain members of the community that Wallace Fletcher's past contained something that ought to be looked into. The rumor was vague in the way that truly effective rumors are, nothing specific, just a suggestion that perhaps the man had left Missouri under circumstances that weren't entirely clean. Wallace found out about it from young Anselm, the schoolteacher, who had become an unexpected ally and who delivered the intelligence with the anxious expression of a man who is not accustomed to the operational realities of small-town intrigue. Wallace sat with this for an evening, and then in the morning he went to see Reverend Alcott. He told the Reverend the complete truth of his past in Missouri, which was thoroughly uninteresting from a scandal perspective. He had grown up poor and worked hard and driven cattle and been cheated and moved on. There was nothing in it that required concealing. He told Alcott where he had been, whom he had worked for, what had happened with the wages, and offered the name of his former employer as a reference if one were wanted. Alcott listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who has heard many confessions and has learned to distinguish the weight of true ones. "I am not concerned," Alcott said. "I will say what I know to be true to anyone who asks me." "I appreciate it," Wallace said. "But what concerns me more is whether Hester hears it secondhand. I'd rather she hear it from me." "That," said Alcott, "is the right instinct." He went to Hester that same evening and told her about the rumor and then told her the same complete truth he had told Alcott. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment. "I know who is behind this," she said. "Yes." "And you know why," she said. "Yes." "Does it change anything you've told me?" "No," he said. She nodded once. "Then I suggest we ignore it and get married in 3 weeks." And that was the end of it, as far as she was concerned. She was not a woman who gave much energy to enemies unless they required it. Pruitt made no further moves. Whether it was the community's response to the rumor, which was largely skeptical because the community had watched Wallace Fletcher work an honest day's work every day for 4 months, and found it difficult to reconcile that with the vague suggestions of scandal, or whether it was something else, the campaign simply faded. Wallace suspected Alcott had a word with certain key figures, which was something Alcott neither confirmed nor denied. March came in with cold mornings and warm afternoons, that particular Kansas spring quality of a day that starts in winter and ends in something that remembers summer. The church had been decorated by the women of the congregation with early flowers from wherever they could be found, and the pews held perhaps 40 people, which was most of the town. Emmett Gale sat in the front row in a suit that was clearly from an earlier decade, and sat on his frame with the authority of a suit that has been worn at important occasions and knows its function. Mrs. Croft was there, and Mrs. Fitch, and young Anselm, who looked moved in the way that young schoolteachers sometimes are by the evidence that life can be generous. Old Dooley, who had somehow appointed himself a member of Wallace's informal proceedings, sat beside Emmett with the satisfied expression of a man who has been present at history. Hester came down the aisle of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell on a March morning in 1879. In a dress she had made herself from fabric she had been saving without knowing what she was saving it for, a deep ivory with a small pattern of leaves in the weave, and her copper hair was properly pinned for once with small white flowers from her own garden tucked into it. And she walked without hurry and without nerves, because she was Hester Bell, and she did not hurry, and she was not afraid. And she looked straight at Wallace Fletcher, where he stood at the front of the church with his hat in his hands, and his suit brushed clean, and his heart somewhere in the approximate region of his throat. Reverend Alcott conducted the ceremony with the warm precision he brought to everything, reading the words of the service with attention to what they meant rather than how they sounded, and when he reached the moment of the vows he paused. It was at that pause that he did something he had not done in quite the same way before. He looked at Wallace, and he said, in the quiet of the church with the morning light coming in through the windows on the south wall, "I want to ask you something before we proceed to the vows. Not because it is required, but because I believe it matters to say the real things out loud." He paused. "Why did you choose her?" The church went very still. Wallace stood in that stillness for a moment with Hester's hands in his, her ring already on her finger from 3 weeks ago when he had asked, and he looked at her face and thought about the question. Not about what answer would sound right or land well or satisfy a room full of witnesses. He thought about the actual truth of it, the whole truth from the beginning. "I rode into this town a year ago," he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried in the still church, "with less than nothing in my pockets and so much gone out of me that I honestly wasn't sure there was much left worth saving." And she was standing in the middle of the street with a broken basket and a dozen smashed eggs, and there was nothing to do about any of it. And she looked at it all, and she picked up what could be saved, and she moved on. He paused. "I didn't choose her for her beauty, though she is beautiful. I didn't choose her for the farm or for practicality or for any reason that has to do with what I needed." He stopped again, and the silence was the kind that a room full of people makes when they have stopped breathing. "I chose her because she showed me, in that first minute, that she was the kind of person who looks at a broken thing and asks what can still be saved. And I have spent the past year discovering that she applies that quality to absolutely everything, to land and animals and situations and broken-down cowboys who ride into town on borrowed horses. And I would like to spend the rest of my life being in the presence of someone who knows how to do that, because I am not sure I was ever going to find my way back to myself without her." He looked at Hester, and she was looking at him with those clear gray-green eyes, and they were bright, very bright. And she was not crying because she was Hester Bell, but she was the closest to crying he had ever seen her, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. He was not aware at first of the sound from the pews. It came to him gradually, a soft sound, general and inevitable, the sound a room full of people makes when something true has been said in their presence, and it has reached all the way down into the places where they keep their own griefs and their own loves and their own broken baskets. Mrs. Croft was pressing a handkerchief to her face. Old Dooley was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is using considerable will to maintain his composure. Emmett Gale was looking straight ahead with his jaw set and his eyes very bright. Young Anselm was not making any attempt at restraint at all. Even Mrs. Fitch, who had the bearing of a woman who did not display emotion publicly, had her hand pressed to her chest. The whole church was crying. Hester squeezed his hands, and then she said, soft and clear, "I chose you because you are the first person who ever looked at me and saw all of me clearly, every hard edge and every difficulty, and stayed." Alcott, whose own voice required a moment to settle, said quietly, "I think the vows will take care of themselves from here." And they did. They were married on a March morning in 1879 in the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, in the presence of 40 people and enough genuine feeling to fill a much larger room. And when they stepped out into the morning light, Hester's hand in the crook of his arm, he felt something so complete and so settled that he recognized it, finally, as what he had been missing for years without knowing what to call it. The reception was held at Mrs. Fitch's boarding house, which she had opened for the occasion with a generosity that surprised and moved them both, and there was food enough for everyone, and someone had brought a fiddle, and the afternoon stretched out long and warm for March, and at some point late in it, Wallace stood beside his wife, which was a word he was going to need some time to get used to in the best possible way, and watched old Emmett Gale dancing with Mrs. Croft in the uncoordinated and enthusiastic way of a man who knows he is terrible at dancing and has long since made peace with it. And Hester leaned into his side and laughed, which was a sound he had heard from her only a handful of times, and which he intended to dedicate considerable effort to hearing more often. They moved his few belongings out to the farm the following week, which was not a complicated undertaking, given that Wallace Fletcher had accumulated very little in the way of possessions over the years of driving cattle. He brought his saddle and his tools and his books, which were only 3 but which he kept carefully, and he brought his mother's letters and the new correspondence tools with which he intended to write longer and more regular letters home, one of which would explain that he had married. His mother's reply, which arrived 6 weeks later, was effusive in the way that his mother's letters always were, covering both sides of 3 sheets of paper, and contained within it the specific observation that she had always known he would fall in love with someone unusual and determined, and that she was delighted but not surprised, and could they please come to Missouri when circumstances allowed. Emmett Gale remained in his cottage on the property, which was where he had lived for 20 years, and from which no force of nature or social convention was going to move him. He and Wallace settled into a working relationship of the spare and efficient variety that is only possible between 2 people who understand each other's value without needing to explain it. And within 2 weeks, they had established a routine for the farm that was more productive than any arrangement Hester had been able to manage with Emmett alone, not because Emmett was insufficient, but because the farm needed more hands than one old man could provide. They planted the spring garden in April with a thoroughness that Hester said she had never been able to achieve on her own, and the rows were straight and the seeds were deep, and by May the garden was beginning to show the results, and Hester stood at the edge of it one morning with her hands on her hips and a look of deep satisfaction on her face. "We may actually not starve," she said. "That was always my intention," he said. She turned to look at him. "You know, when I first saw you ride into town, I thought you looked like a man who was passing through." "I was," he said. "What stopped you?" He looked at her steadily. "You already know what stopped me." She smiled, the real smile, the one she kept for moments when she was not performing anything, and it turned his whole day to gold. Summer in 1879 on the Kansas plains was long and hot and golden, and they worked the farm through it with the particular focus of 2 people who understand that what they are building is real and requires real effort and real tending, which is the same thing love requires, though not everyone makes that connection. The cattle from the drive still moved through Caldwell in their season, and Wallace did some work in town with the drives when they came through, which brought in the supplemental income that made the difference between managing and thriving. Pruitt, it turned out, was largely defanged once the debt was clear. He remained in his store and behind his ledger and his careful smiles, but he had lost his particular purchase on Hester's situation, and without that leverage, he was simply a man who ran a store and had a thumb on his scales, which plenty of people knew about and managed accordingly. In July, Hester told Wallace she was expecting, and she told him in the same matter-of-fact way she said everything, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening with the last of the daylight coming in through the west window, but her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup with a tightness that told him she was feeling more than the voice was showing. He sat with the information for the time it took him to reach across the table and take those hands, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I know how to say," he said. She looked at him, and the look was measuring and also deep, and she said, "I was not sure I wanted to tell you yet. Not until I was more certain, but I find I cannot not tell you things." "Good," he said. "That is exactly as it should be." She leaned her forehead against their joined hands, and he felt the weight of it, the trust of that gesture, which from Hester Bell meant everything. Abraham the old dog died in August, peacefully in his sleep beside the fire where he preferred to sleep, and they buried him under the elm tree at the corner of the property. And Hester stood at the small grave with a quiet face and said, "He was 15 years old and he was a very good dog." And that was her eulogy, which was exactly right. Wallace made a small wooden marker for the grave, which Emmett observed with the expression of a man who finds this entirely appropriate. The baby came in late February, 1880, during a cold snap that set every window in the farmhouse with frost patterns like lace. The local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Hardin, arrived in time, and Emmett Gale spent the duration of the labor outside the farmhouse in the cold without being asked to, which was his way of being present and also of giving them their privacy. The baby was a boy, which was not something either of them had predicted or required, but which arrived as exactly what it was, a fact to be embraced with full commitment. He was a healthy, loud, emphatic boy with Hester's coloring and Wallace's determined jaw, and they named him James Henry Fletcher, the James for Wallace's father who had died when Wallace was 12, and the Henry for Hester's father, about whose financial judgment Wallace had opinions but whose love for his daughter he did not doubt. Wallace held his son for the first time in the lamplit bedroom with frost on the window and Hester watching from the pillow with a face that was exhausted and luminous simultaneously, and he could not speak for a moment. When he could, he said to her, "You are extraordinary." "I am tired," she said. "Both things," he said. Emmett Gale was admitted after a tactful interval, and he looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has been alive long enough to know that this is the real thing, and he said, "Well, I suppose the farm will need to be bigger." He was not wrong. The spring and summer of 1880 were the busiest of Wallace's life, which was saying something given the 6 years of cattle drives. The farm had to expand to genuinely support a family of 3 plus Emmett, who remained firmly in his cottage and equally firmly in their daily lives. Wallace added 2 more acres under cultivation and struck an arrangement with a neighboring rancher named Pike, a quiet man of middle age who respected a fair deal, to run some cattle on the back pasture in a share arrangement that brought in the kind of steady income that made the winter arithmetic less anxious. Hester, who had been managing a farm alone for 18 months before Wallace arrived, proved to be a formidable partner in the planning of the farm's expansion, with a clarity about what the land could bear and what it could not that came from years of paying careful attention. They made decisions together at the kitchen table in the evenings after James had been put down to sleep, with the lamp burning between them and papers spread across the table. And those evenings were some of Wallace's favorites of his entire life, not because of anything dramatic in them, but because of the exact quality of being 2 people who fully respect each other's minds working on a shared problem. He told her this once, rather than letting it simply rest unsaid, because he had made a commitment to himself after the wedding to say the important things out loud rather than assuming they were known. She had looked at him with a quiet surprise and then said, "I feel the same way about these evenings," in a voice that was entirely unguarded, and then she went back to the papers, and he went back to the papers, and the lamp burned between them, and it was enough. In the fall of 1880, Wallace's mother came from Missouri, making the journey with his second youngest brother, Daniel, who was 24 and curious about the West and also, it emerged, about the possibility of land of his own. Sarah Fletcher was a woman of 62 with her eldest son's calm eyes and his capacity for saying what she meant without ceremony, and she arrived in Caldwell on the afternoon stage with 3 trunks and a clear intention to thoroughly inspect everything. She approved of Hester in approximately 45 minutes, which Wallace gathered from the quality of the conversation between the 2 women over the first supper, which had a warmth in it that was not performed. He overheard, from the doorway, his mother saying to Hester, "He wrote me about you before he knew he was writing about you. He described you as a capable woman and then spent 3 paragraphs describing how you dealt with a problem with a fence post." There was a pause. "That is how I knew. Daniel liked the farm and stayed for 6 weeks and then went further west to Colorado, which was where Wallace had originally intended to go, and Wallace found this not in the least bit ironic. They wrote to each other regularly. Everyone seemed to write more regularly now. Life had organized itself around this place and these people, which was something Wallace could not have predicted or planned for, and which was therefore perhaps the most genuine thing that had ever happened to him. Hester's brothers, the ones who had gone to California before the debt had fully landed, wrote in the fall of 1880, 2 letters arriving within a week of each other. Hester read them both at the kitchen table and then set them down and looked out the window for a long time. "They want to know if the farm is doing all right," she said. "And what will you tell them?" Wallace asked. "The truth," she said, "that it is better than all right." She paused. "And that they are welcome to visit if they like, but that the place is mine and I am not looking for partners in the management of it." "That seems precise," he said. "I have had some practice at being precise," she said. James Fletcher grew from a loud, emphatic baby into a loud, emphatic toddler who had strong opinions about most things and expressed them at considerable volume, which both of his parents found charming in a way that surprised them, given that neither of them was particularly loud. He had Hester's practical intelligence and Wallace's calm stubbornness, which was a combination that was either going to be very admirable or very challenging as he matured, possibly both. Emmett Gale, who had resigned himself to old age with stoic grace, found an unexpected second purpose in James, who regarded him with the undiscriminating adoration of a small child for an interesting old person. Emmett, in turn, taught the boy the names of every plant on the property and the habits of every bird that visited it, and sometimes in the late afternoon they could be found sitting together on the garden wall, Emmett talking and the boy listening with uncharacteristic stillness, which Wallace noted with private wonder. By 1882, the farm was genuinely prospering. Not wealthy, not in the way of the cattle barons or the railroad men whose money was moving through Kansas in those years like a different kind of weather, but solid and real and growing, the kind of prosperity that comes from people who pay attention and work hard and make careful decisions. They had added 2 horses to the stable, a flock of laying hens that Hester managed with a systematic efficiency that produced reliable income, and the back pasture arrangement with Rancher Pike had expanded to include a permanent small herd that Wallace managed with the skill of a man who has spent years understanding cattle. Caldwell itself was changing in those years, as the cattle trade evolved and the railroad's influence grew, and the town accumulated more permanence and more complexity. The lawlessness that had characterized some of the earlier years was gradually giving way to the particular kind of order that comes when enough people have something worth protecting. There were more families now, more children in Anselm's school, more women with gardens and ambitions for a proper library. Prewitt sold his store in 1882 to a young man from St. Louis who used honest weights, which was noticed and appreciated, and moved on to some other territory. No one who knew the history of the Morrow farm debt was entirely sorry to see him go, though they said as much only among themselves with appropriate circumspection. Reverend Alcott remained at the First Baptist Church and remained a friend to them both, the kind of friendship that is built on the mutual recognition of shared values and doesn't require constant maintenance because it is rooted in something real. He came to supper once a month, at Hester's standing invitation, and he and Wallace played chess badly, and Hester read or sewed, and James terrorized the dog, who by this point was a young spaniel named Franklin that James had named after careful consideration. Franklin, it turned out, was a better dog than Abraham had been in terms of energy and enthusiasm, though Abraham had had the advantage in dignity, which Wallace mentioned once and Hester laughed. In the spring of 1883, Hester told Wallace she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table in the evening, but this time without the same tightness in the hands around the coffee cup. She was calmer with it, or perhaps more accurately, she was less alone with it, which is a different kind of calm. "James is going to have an opinion about this," she said. "James has an opinion about everything," Wallace said. "He does," she said, with the fond, helpless expression that James tended to produce in both of them. The second child arrived in late October, a girl this time, and she came into the world with the same emphatic quality as her brother, but with a watchful quality underneath it that was entirely her own. They named her Clara Ruth Fletcher, the Clara for no particular precedent but because it suited her, and the Ruth because Hester's mother, who had died when Hester was 9, had been Ruth, and there was something in the October baby's eyes that Hester said reminded her of a face she remembered imperfectly and loved perfectly. James, who was 3, was initially uncertain about Clara but came around to her with a rapidity that surprised both parents, and by the end of the first week he was explaining to her, with great seriousness, the names of the birds and the plants, which was clearly Emmett's influence coming through a generation. Emmett Gale, who was now 68 and walking a little slower and hearing a little less, held Clara on the day she arrived and looked at her for a long time and said nothing, and then said, "I was not sure I would see the farm get to this," and then went outside in a hurry, and Wallace let him go without comment. The farm in autumn in 1883 was everything. Wallace would think about that sometimes, in the way that people think about their own lives when they can feel the weight of what they have accumulated. The fields golden at harvest, the vegetable garden put up for winter, the horses in the stable, the children in the house, the woman beside him who had picked up a broken basket on a street in Caldwell and shown him, in that first minute, everything he needed to know about who she was. He had come into this town 5 years ago with a cracked heart and a borrowed horse and no real plan, and he had left his plan behind in the street alongside those 12 broken eggs and had not regretted it for a single day. There were hard days. The farm had them, seasons when the weather was unkind or the prices for what they grew were low or Emmett's health gave them worry or one of the children was sick, and the nights were long with the kind of quiet fear that illness brings. There was a winter, in 1884, when a cold snap came in hard and early and took most of their poultry flock and threatened the back pasture herd, and they worked through it together for 3 weeks with a focus that left little room for anything but necessity. On the other side of those 3 weeks, sitting at the kitchen table in the particular exhausted peace that comes after a long crisis has resolved, Hester had looked at him across the table and said, "We are going to be all right," not because everything was perfect, but because they were together and they were capable and they knew the difference between a setback and an ending. "Yes," he said, "we are." She reached across and put her hand on his, and they sat like that until the coffee went cold. The Reverend Alcott was fond of saying, in his sermons, that love was not a feeling that happened to you, but a practice that you chose, every day, in the specific ordinary decisions of living, alongside another person. Wallace had not always been a man who paid much attention to sermons, but that one he remembered and recognized as accurate. He chose her every morning when he came downstairs, and she was already in the kitchen with coffee made, not because she was required to make it, but because She was a person who got up early and had energy for things and thought about other people's needs, with the same practical attention she gave to everything. He chose her every evening when they sat together after the children were in bed, and the house was quiet and they talked or were silent with equal ease, which is the rarest and most comfortable thing that two people can manage together. He chose her in the ways she could see, and in the ways she couldn't, in the intentions he brought to every day, in the effort he made to be the man she had trusted him to be. And she chose him. He knew it not from declarations, though she made those too in her direct and unadorned way, but from the evidence of every day, from the way she told him things she did not tell other people, from the way she consulted him and also disagreed with him when she thought he was wrong, which was a form of respect more valuable than agreement, from the way she touched his face sometimes, briefly, and with great tenderness, when she passed him in the kitchen or the barn, a touch so brief he almost wondered if he had imagined it but always knew he hadn't. James started school in Anselm's schoolhouse in 1885, at 5 years old, and proved to be a student of extraordinary curiosity and challenging classroom behavior, in that he wanted to know everything immediately and was impatient with the pace at which instruction proceeded. Anselm, who had by this time been teaching in Caldwell for 7 years and was both more patient and more confident than the slightly confused young man from Ohio who had arrived in 1878, handled James with a skill that Wallace privately admired. "Your son," Anselm told him at church one Sunday, "is the most interested and most exhausting student I have had in 7 years of teaching." "That sounds about right," Wallace said. "He will be remarkable," Anselm said, "if he learns patience." "I'll work on it with him," Wallace said. "Tell him to talk to Emmett Gale about it," Anselm said. "I've noticed that's where the patience comes from when he has it." Clara, who would reach school age in 2 years, watched her brother's departure for school with the focused attention of a child who is filing information away for later use. She was a quiet child compared to James, which did not mean she was a simple one. She was the child who asked the questions that took the longest to answer, and who accepted vague answers with the polite skepticism of someone who will pursue the matter later when you are less prepared. She had her mother's eyes, exactly in color and in the quality of their attention, and when Wallace looked at her sometimes, he felt the particular tenderness of seeing something he loved in the face of someone he was growing to love, which is one of the specific privileges of parenthood. In 1886, Emmett Gale had a winter that was hard on him, a persistent cough that Mrs. Hardin, the midwife, who served as the closest thing Caldwell had to a general practitioner for most medical matters, said was the kind of thing that needed warmth and rest and plain food. Hester brought him into the main house for the duration of it, installing him in the room that had been the parlor before they expanded the house, and Emmett accepted this with the dignity of a man who knows when to stop arguing and also knows that some forms of care are worth accepting. He recovered largely, though the cough stayed with him in diminished form, and in the spring he was back in his cottage and back at his work, though at a somewhat reduced pace that he and Wallace managed between them with a tacit adjustment of expectations that required no discussion. Wallace had turned 36 in the spring of 1886, and sometimes when he rode out to check the back pasture in the early morning, with the light coming in flat and golden over the plains and the smell of the grass warming in it, he thought about the man he had been when he rode into Caldwell on that August morning 8 years ago. The man who had been so tired and so emptied out that he wasn't sure there was much left. The man who had stopped his horse in the street because a woman was picking up broken pieces of a basket. He thought about all the road that had come between that morning and this one, the work and the difficulty, and the seasons and the children, and the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of days, lived in genuine partnership with a person he genuinely loved. And he felt, in those early mornings on the back pasture, something he could only describe as gratitude of a kind that goes all the way down. He rode home and she was in the kitchen and coffee was on the stove, and she looked up when he came in and said, "The south fence." "Still holding," he said. "Good," she said, and poured him a cup. He stood in his own kitchen on a morning in 1886 with a cup of coffee in his hand and his wife beside him and the sound of his children beginning to wake up upstairs, and he thought, "This is the piece of land I was looking for, not the Colorado parcel I imagined. This, exactly. Right here." Reverend Alcott retired from the First Baptist Church of Caldwell in 1887, which was a loss felt genuinely by the whole community, and especially by Wallace and Hester, who had been friends to him for 8 years. His farewell sermon was attended by more people than any service in the church's history, and afterward there was a reception at which he stood with a cup of cider and a kind face, and accepted the gratitude of people with the same calm attention he had brought to all of it. He sought them out specifically, which was characteristic of him. He stood with them beside the window, and he said to Wallace, "I have married a great many couples in my time. I still think about that question I asked you." "So do I," Wallace said. "Do you have a different answer now?" Alcott asked. 8 years on, Wallace thought about it. Beside him, Hester was listening with her head slightly tilted, which was her listening posture. "No," he said. "I have more evidence for the same answer." He looked at Hester. "She picks up what can be saved always. I have watched her do it for 8 years, with the farm and with people and with me on the occasions when I have needed it." He paused. "I am still the most grateful person in this room." Alcott looked at Hester. "And your answer, why him?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to real questions. "Because he showed up," she said. "Every day, without exception, for 8 years. That is what I trust, not a feeling but a practice. He chooses me every day. I have never once doubted it." Alcott's face had the expression of a man who has found the thing he was looking for. "I am going to take that with me," he said, "and add it to the things I know to be true." The new reverend, a younger man named Hadley, was competent and well-meaning, and Caldwell adjusted to him with the pragmatic goodwill of a community that has learned to value stability over novelty. In 1888, they made the trip to Missouri to visit Wallace's mother, which they had been promising for 9 years. The children were 8 and 5, old enough to travel with more management than exhaustion, and the journey on the train, which had become practical as the railroads expanded, was an adventure that James narrated continuously, and Clara observed with the systematic attention of a documentarian. Sarah Fletcher, at 70, was the same woman she had always been, with all her energy concentrated into a smaller compass, and she held her grandchildren with a fierceness that the children seemed to find entirely correct. And she sat with Hester on the porch of the house in Hannibal, and they talked for 2 hours without Wallace, who was visiting with his brothers. And he came back and found them deep in something that made him feel warm in a way he couldn't specifically articulate, but that had to do with the sense of a world that is well connected. He sat down beside his wife on the porch of his mother's house in Missouri on an August evening, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had learned to do, and the fireflies were coming up from the grass in the yard, and James was chasing them with the conviction of a boy who believes catching is possible, and Clara was sitting very still on the steps watching them with her mother's eyes. And Sarah Fletcher was watching all of them with the expression of a woman who is reviewing the full account of her life and finding it, on balance, very good. "I am glad you stopped," Hester said, quietly, meaning the horse in the street, the basket, all of it. "I had no choice," he said. "You always had a choice," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad I made it." She took his hand and they sat in the firefly-lit evening and said nothing else, because there was nothing else needed. They went back to Kansas in September, rested and grounded, and resumed the work of the farm with the renewed energy of people who have been reminded by distance of what they are returning to. Emmett Gale turned 73 in the fall of 1888, and he observed this fact with the serene commentary that he had not expected to see it. Wallace told him he expected to see him reach 80, which Emmett received with the expression of a man who is pleased by the ambition, even if he holds the probability at arm's length. The children grew with the reliable speed that children grow, which is to say in a way that always surprises the parents even though they have been watching it happen. James at 9 was the boy Anselm had predicted, remarkable in his curiosity, still working on patience, capable of real kindness in the specific way of children who have grown up in houses where kindness is practiced rather than merely preached. He wanted to know how everything worked, the farm machinery and the cattle and the stars and the way bread rises, and he followed Wallace and Emmett with equal attention and wrote his questions in a small book he kept in his pocket, which was Hester's idea and which Wallace thought was the best idea he had witnessed. Clara at 6 started school and was the kind of student who finished her work and then waited with patient impatience for the next task, which was a quality that Anselm said was both a gift and a challenge to accommodate. She was serious about things that mattered and easygoing about things that didn't, which was a discernment that most people don't develop until much later in life, if at all. She was, in temperament, the child who most visibly combined both of her parents, Hester's practicality and Wallace's quiet steadiness, with her own particular quality of observation that seemed to be entirely her own. In the spring of 1889, Hester came to Wallace in the barn where he was working with the particular expression that he had learned over 10 years, to read as Hester about to say something important. She told him she was expecting again, a third child. She was 34, which she noted with characteristic directness as a relevant fact, and she was healthy and the farm was solid and they had the space and the means, and she looked at him with the question underneath the statement. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Surprised," she said, "and glad." A pause. "You." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "You have given me everything I did not know to ask for." He said it simply, without performance. "Yes, I am glad." She let out a breath, and it was the breath of a woman who has been holding something and is relieved to put it down. And then she went back into the house, because she was Hester Bell Fletcher and she did not stand around when there were things to be done. The third child arrived on a January morning in 1890, a boy they named Samuel Emmett Fletcher. The Samuel because it was a name that had been in Wallace's family unused for a generation and wanted to be used, and the Emmett because Emmett Gale, who was 74, arrived at the house the morning after the birth with an expression that tried to be ordinary and failed entirely. And when Hester said, "His middle name is Emmett," the old man sat down in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands and was quiet for a moment, and then stood up and straightened his jacket and said, "Well, that's a fine name," in a voice that was not entirely steady. "It's the finest name I know," Hester said, and met Wallace's eyes over Emmett's head, and the look between them was everything. Samuel Emmett Fletcher came into a family that was already a small civilization in the best sense, deeply rooted, clearly structured, full of warmth and work and books and animals, and the kind of daily order that comes from people who know what they are doing and why. James, now 10, received his brother with the magnanimity of a boy who has decided to be excellent about something and is committed to the decision. He explained to Samuel, in the serious way he explained most things, about the farm and the animals and the stars and what to expect. Samuel, who was several days old, received this information with the expressionless equanimity of the very new. Clara, who was 7, asked to hold the baby with formal seriousness, and then sat very still with him for a long time, looking at his face with the focused attention she brought to things she was determined to understand fully. "He has Papa's nose," she said, finally. "He does," Hester agreed. "That's a good nose to have," Clara said, and then carefully returned the baby and went back to her book. Wallace stood in the doorway and watched his family in the lamplight, his wife in the chair by the fire with the baby, his daughter with her book, the sound of James somewhere upstairs probably writing questions in his notebook, And he thought about a cracked heart and a borrowed horse and a street in Caldwell in August, and a woman picking up the pieces of what could still be saved. He walked in and sat beside his wife and put his arm around her, careful of the baby, and she leaned into him in the way that was so familiar it was indistinguishable now from comfort itself. "Are you happy?" He asked her not because he doubted the answer but because he believed in asking the real questions out loud. She thought about it, which was how she answered things, not the first thought but the considered one. "I am," she said, "not the simple kind, the real kind." "Tell me the difference," he said, because he wanted to hear her say it. She looked at the fire and at the baby and then at him. "The simple kind is when everything is perfect and nothing hurts. The real kind is when things are sometimes hard and sometimes wonderful and sometimes just ordinary, and you look at where you are and who you are with and you think, 'This is what I chose, and I would choose it again.'" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She put her head against his shoulder and the fire burned low and the baby slept and the house was warm and the Kansas plains lay out beyond the windows in the January dark, vast and cold and full of stars, the same stars he had looked at from a cattle drive 1,000 miles of hard trail ago, the same stars that had been there every night of his life pointing him here to this place, to this woman, to this. Emmett Gale reached 75 in the fall of 1890, and he did it with the air of a man who is not entirely surprised, but is prepared to treat it as an accomplishment. James and Clara baked him a cake under Hester's supervision, and Samuel watched the proceedings from the floor with the focused attention of a baby who is absorbing everything and filing it away. The cake was uneven and excellent, and Emmett ate 2 pieces, and said it was the best cake he had ever eaten, which was something he said every year, and which was also probably true. The farm by 1890 was something that Wallace would not have been able to fully imagine when he rode in 10 years before. It was the Morrow farm no longer, at least not in the way anyone thought of it. It was the Fletcher place, and it was prospering, and the fence lines were good, and the garden was abundant, and the herd on the back pasture was healthy, and the family in the house was whole. Reverend Alcott came back to visit in the summer of 1890, returning from his retirement in Illinois to see his brother in Caldwell, and he came to supper on a Tuesday evening. He was 62 and white-haired, and his eyes were still kind, and he sat at their table and ate Hester's cooking and talked about everything with the ease of a man who is at home, wherever good people are. After supper, on the porch in the evening air, he sat with Wallace and said, "You look like a man who has become exactly what he was supposed to be." "I had help," Wallace said. "The best kind," Alcott said. "The kind that doesn't know it's helping." Wallace looked out at the farm in the summer evening, at the fields and the fence lines and the light on the barn and the garden laid out orderly and full. James was in the yard chasing lightning bugs, because some things persist across years, and Clara was reading on the porch steps with Samuel asleep on a blanket beside her, and from inside the house came the sound of Hester moving in the kitchen with the quiet efficiency that was the sound of home. "Yes," Wallace said, "the best kind." Alcott was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have thought many times about that question I asked you in the church. I have told the story of your answer to more people than I can count. I hope the story was useful," Wallace said. "A story that tells the truth is always useful," Alcott said. "Especially the kind of truth that people recognize from inside their own lives." The summer rolled on, long and full, the way the best summers are, and when Alcott left at the end of his visit he shook Wallace's hand and embraced Hester, and he said, "Whatever comes next, you are ready for it," which was both a benediction and an accurate assessment. Hester, who had been watching him go with a warm smile, said, when the wagon had turned out of the drive, "He has always said exactly the right thing." "It's a rare gift," Wallace said. "So is this," she said, gesturing at all of it, the farm and the evening and the children and the life. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." The years continued to accumulate the way good years do, each one distinct, and each one part of the same long, beautiful thing. James finished school and came into the farm work with the ferocious focus of a young man who has decided something is worth doing properly, and then began to show an interest in land law that made Wallace remember, with some amusement, his own abandoned intention of studying law at 20. He made arrangements with some difficulty and considerable determination to read law with an attorney who had established himself in Caldwell by 1892, a man named Forsyth who respected James's intelligence and was honest about the effort it would require. Clara, at 9, and then 10, and then 11, was becoming a person of considerable precision and wit, with her mother's clear eyes and her father's steadiness, and her own particular quality of seeing clearly without cruelty, which is a combination not given to everyone. She was the child who asked the adults in her life the questions they had not prepared for, always respectfully and always with genuine curiosity, and always with the quiet expectation that they would answer honestly. Samuel grew from a watchful baby into a cheerful, solid boy who was the most temperamentally uncomplicated of the three children, which was perhaps fortunate given the amount of complication his siblings provided. He loved the farm animals with an uncritical passion, and by the time he was 2 had developed a specific relationship with the horses that Emmett Gale observed with great respect. "He has a feeling for animals," Emmett told Wallace. "Same way some people have a feeling for land." "It's not taught." "No," Wallace agreed, "it comes from somewhere else." Emmett, at 75 and then 76, kept moving with the determination of a man who has decided that stopping is not an option. He was slower and needed more rest, and could not do what he had once done, but he was present and sharp in his mind and valued in a way that had nothing to do with what he produced and everything to do with who he was. The children treated him with the natural, unself-conscious affection of children who have been raised in a house where respect for people is practiced rather than preached. And this, Wallace thought, was perhaps the thing he was most proud of in how he and Hester had built their household. On a fall evening in 1892, when the harvest was done and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Hester came and sat beside Wallace at the kitchen table where he was doing the farm accounts, and she put a cup of coffee beside him and another in front of herself, and she sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular. "What?" he said, because in 13 years of marriage he had learned to read the particular quality of her silences. She looked at him. "I was thinking about the eggs," she said. He waited. "The morning I dropped them," she said, "I was having the worst month I could remember. My father had been dead 6 months. The debt was sitting on me like a stone. Emmett had hurt his back and couldn't do a full day's work, and I had gotten up that morning and gathered those eggs, and I thought, if I can just get these to Pruitt and get the credit, I can hold another week. And then I dropped them in the middle of the street, and I thought." She stopped. "What did you think?" he said. "I thought, well, I can stand here and cry about it, or I can pick up what's left." She looked at him. "And I picked up what was left. And then a man with dusty trail clothes and honest eyes offered to fix my basket, and I thought, I don't know what this is, but it is something." He was very still. "You never told me that," he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't ready to for a long time. And now," she looked at him with those creekwater eyes that were still, 13 years on, the clearest and most direct eyes he had ever looked into, "now I think it every day, that the worst morning of my worst month turned out to be the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to me, and I want you to know that I know it, every day." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she took his back, and the lamp burned between them on the table with the farm accounts and the quiet house around them, and outside the Kansas plains were dark and enormous and full of stars, and everything was exactly as it should be and had been, and would continue to be. He thought about all the roads that lead to a moment and all the choices, small and large, that a person makes without knowing where they are going, and he thought about a compass needle that settles north without ceremony and without drama and stays there reliably for the rest of its life. He thought about what Reverend Alcott had asked him, standing in the church in a March morning in 1879, with the light coming through the south windows and 40 people watching. Why did you choose her? And he thought about his answer, which had been the truth then and remained the truth now and would remain the truth for every year that was left to him. She picks up what can be saved, including me, especially me. He pressed her hand between both of his, and she looked at him with the full, unguarded warmth that she kept for moments when they were alone, and the house was quiet, and there was no performance required from either of them. And he felt, as he had felt every day for 13 years and intended to go on feeling for every day that remained, profoundly and irreversibly in love with her. "Me too," she said, as though he had said it out loud, which was, after all, exactly what he had meant. The Fletcher farm stood on the Kansas plains east of Caldwell for many years after that, tended by people who understood the value of tending, and the fence lines stayed good, and the garden stayed full, and the horses knew their handler, and the children grew into people worth knowing. And the man and the woman who had built it all from a broken basket and a borrowed hammer, and the specific and irreplaceable fact of choosing each other every single day, sat on the porch in the evenings, and watched the light go gold across the fields, and were, in the fullest and most real and most lasting sense of the word, home.